Good afternoon, Lord Brailsford.
Good afternoon, Miss Stewart. Now, you've got 2 witnesses for us this afternoon, is that correct?
That's right. Our final witness evidence today, my lord, comes from a panel of 2. Mr Hutton, who is the current General Secretary of School Leaders Scotland, or SLS, and Mr Thulis, who held that role during the pandemic.
Very good. Good afternoon, Mr Hutton. Good afternoon, Mr Thulis.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Right, Miss Stewart, when you're ready, please.
Thank you. Mr Thulis, can you please confirm your full name?
Good afternoon, my name is Jim Thulis.
And you've provided a statement to the inquiry?
I did, yes.
And for the benefit of the transcript, that's to be found at WT 0373. Mr Hutton, can you please confirm your full name?
Graham William Hutton.
And again, you also have provided a statement to the inquiry?
Yes.
And for the benefit of the transcript, that statement can be found at WT 0504_5 and 1. Now, Mr Hutton, prior to drafting your own witness statement, you'd had sight of that prepared by Mr Thulis and had drafted a confirmatory statement.
I did.
And that, my lord, is at number WT 0504_5 and a 3. I'll come to you first of all, Mr Thulis. You retired in August 2023, but immediately before your retirement, between 2015 and your retirement, you were General Secretary of SLS.
Yes, I was.
Thank you. Before going on to tell us about your role with that organisation during the pandemic, can you tell us a little bit about the organisation, its aims and its purpose?
Yes, indeed. School Leaders Scotland is the professional association which represents those in Scottish secondary schools who hold a leadership responsibility. So it extends within secondary schools through head teachers, deputy head teachers, and the group immediately thereafter of principal teachers, faculty heads, those who have a management responsibility, a leadership responsibility. It also includes school business managers, bursars, and there are a few members who have moved out with the formal school sector and who work with local authorities and have applied to retain their membership in School Leaders Scotland, who still do retain membership.
And is it exclusively for those working in secondary education?
Secondary education in Scottish secondary schools, both state sector and private sector.
And does that include special schools?
It does. There are some members in special schools, yes.
Thank you. Mr Hutton, do you have anything to add in terms of the current membership?
Yeah, we have a current membership of 1,266 in over 75% of secondary Scottish secondary heads are our members, and we have representation in about 90% of secondary schools in Scotland.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Mr Thulis, in terms of your role as General Secretary during the pandemic period, what did that entail?
During the pandemic period, as perhaps within other periods, but in perhaps a more acute way, my responsibility was to represent members, represent the views of members and communicate information and guidance coming from government, COSLA and various other national organisations to our members in areas which was relevant to the way in which they conducted their professional duties.
And Mr Hutton, that is a role you now hold since Mr Thulis's retirement last August.
I do.
Immediately prior to taking up that role, Mr Hutton, you were a head teacher of a Scottish secondary school of Grove Academy, and that's a post you held for 12 years, is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about Grove Academy? For example, is it a state or private school, and what's its size?
Grove Academy is a state school run by Dundee City Council. It is a 6-year comprehensive in Broughty Ferry, and the roll in my day was 1350. So it's quite a big school. It serves, as I say, Broughty Ferry and the surroundings, and due to its reputation, the school attracts pupils from across Dundee and further. The school was opened in 1889 and moved into a brand new PPP building in 2009. It has a teaching staff of approximately 98 full-time equivalent, including four, obviously one head teacher, 4 deputies, 18 principal that was the case when I was at 18 principal teachers, now 10 faculty heads, and 8 principal teachers of guidance to look after the pastoral well-being of the young people. The school is also fortunate in the quality of its support staff.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about your role as a head teacher, in particular, what that role involved during the pandemic period?
Yep. Well, I would say, as I say, the main responsibilities were ensuring the quality of learning and teaching in the school, about leading and managing the school, involving pupils, staff, parents and partners. It was about building a team to help and support our young people, and it was about building a suitable and relevant curriculum for the young people to follow. It was also about dealing with the health and well-being of pupils, particularly through the guidance system, and the health and well-being of my staff as well, through a duty of care. It was also about organising budgets, staffing, health and safety aspects, and resources. I think during COVID, it was definitely number one was ensuring the health and safety and well-being of pupils and staff in school and out with school. It was about organising the hubs and having responsibility for their function. A responsibility I shared with 3 primary heads in the cluster during the first lockdown. It was ensuring sufficient PPE was available for all, and it was about making sure that the guidance staff were in contact with pupils and were checking on their welfare as well, as far as they could in their capabilities. It was also about maintaining social distance within the school building and ensuring that the bubbles of young people, as it were, first year separated from, that they didn't mix. It was also involving timetabling appropriately in very difficult circumstances, particularly when after the return to schools after the first lockdown, and just ensuring that all the other things that I mentioned earlier, which is the normal responsibilities of a head teacher, were also still being done.
Thank you, that's helpful. You've mentioned there coordination of hub schools, and that's something that we'll come on to speak about in a short while. Were you a member of SLS at the time?
Yes, I was.
Pandemic. Thank you. And were you in communication with them regarding impacts and observations you had about how things were going within schools?
I was indeed. I was at that point president of School Leaders Scotland. I just started in November and was kind of halfway through my term when the first lockdown came. So I was quite in constant contact with Jim as president and through the presidential team that we have there, discussing things that we felt, how do we take this forward with our members. And Jim had consulted very widely with the presidential team, with the core team, and we did work very well as a team to make sure that we were supplying as much information as possible to our members in schools across Scotland.
Thank you. The first match I want to discuss with you is the closure, which we're referring to it as a closure of schools. Of course, we know they didn't completely close because there were hub schools and learning and teaching continued. But I want to speak to you essentially about what we're calling the closure and the move to online learning and teaching. Mr. Hutton, you speak in your statement at paragraph 12 and following on this matter. And you express there that learning and teaching in this online format was a challenge for both pupils and staff. Can you first explain about the challenges met by pupils?
The various challenges met by pupils. First of all, they were not in class. They were missing the very important input of the teacher. And although we have online teaching, online learning now, and we talk about AI taking over from teachers, the actual physical being in the classroom has a huge impact on young people. And the body language was missing, the encouragement, the signs of encouragement and help were not there as well. Young people found it frustrating that when they contacted their teacher, it maybe took a number of days or a number of hours at least for them to respond, whereas in class, with their hand up, they would get almost instant feedback on their work. So I think there was also the issue that young people felt isolated, and they felt lonely. I spoke to one young man later on in my 5-a-day with my daily conversations with pupils in school about what the impacts of the lockdown. And one boy, who a very intelligent boy with tears welling in his eyes, said, "I was just so lonely. I did not have the contact that I needed. I didn't have the contact with my teachers." I found that frustrating as well. I think also for young people was they weren't sure how this would progress, and they didn't have the teaching that they normally would have had in class, and therefore when they came up against an issue, they quite often came to a stop, and they had to wait until they had some sort of contact with the teacher to take that further, whereas that would not have happened in class. So they then realised, of course, that there were going to be gaps in their learning, and maybe we'll come back to that later on. For staff, it was very difficult to adapt from being the teacher in the classroom, maybe not the sage on the stage, but to be actually with the young people. Teaching is a very social activity in that you're interacting every day with between up to 30 young people in a class, and therefore not having that and not having the immediacy of the young people in the room and the atmosphere in the room and the banter, as it were, that is missing from your experience as a teacher. The move to online learning was very difficult for a lot of members of staff. A, because they had no experience in it. B, because they had not the ability to do it. And C, they never had the training on how to use Teams, Google Meet, or whatever, Zoom. And then there was also the issues that in some of the local authorities, Zoom in particular was banned and it was blocked, and therefore they had to make sure that they were using an appropriate method of communicating to the young people how they were to be learning.
Thank you. You mentioned in your statement about issues in terms of what we might term digital inclusion, connectivity issues and issues to do with devices. Was that, in your view, a barrier to learning for some or all pupils?
That was a definite barrier to learning. Schools were closed very quickly, and we didn't really have any time to prepare properly for the move to online learning. And at that point, in my school, every member of staff had an iPad, but the young people hadn't, and that was in the plan to come, that each person would eventually have, each young person would have an iPad. And in some local authorities, they were lucky enough to have a one-to-one device for each young person. And that was not always possible for the young people in my school. Probably more so in my school, it would have been worse in one of the other schools in Dundee where I had previously taught. So at home, there may not have been a lot of devices which were connected to the internet. It may well be that in a family of maybe two young people and a mother and father who were both working from home, that they maybe only had one device between them, and therefore for the parents the important is that they had to do their, be involved in their work, and therefore that left the access to the internet and to online learning later on in the day. And what we found then later on was that young people were moving their experience to later on in the day. Some of my staff were amazed that they were getting work sent to them at 3 o'clock in the morning, and therefore their day began to shift as well. There was the issue of even if they had a device at home, the connectivity was poor, or they didn't have any connectivity because of the cost involved in doing so. So that meant we had to look at this very carefully, and we cannibalised as many things we had, devices as we had in school, some of them quite old and clunky and slow. And then we tried to provide dongles that would help them access the internet through access the internet easily enough, and made sure that if they needed a device, the guidance staff would contact them. People we thought maybe didn't have a device or whom staff had seen there was no response from them. And then later on, the Scottish Government provided more laptops for young people, and they were distributed through the local authority as well. And so slowly but surely we did get to the point where just about every young person had access, either through a device provided by the school or by the local authority, to ensure that they had a connection to the internet.
Thank you. Mr. Thulis, is that picture that's been given by Mr. Hutton one that was replicated across the country?
Yes and no, in that there were, at the point of the first lockdown, the first school closures, some local authorities in which young people were better served than others and better able to prepare for learning at home than others. Some were in worse positions than Mr. Hutton found himself, in that there were large parts of Scotland where broadband access was an issue. There were individual young people and individual schools where access and accessibility was much more of a problem, just depending on the nature of the school. So it was a mixed picture across the country. Some areas served better than others, some areas really quite poorly served. And that was just a matter of fact related to the closure of a system at a particular point in time. From then on, the sort of catching up part of it, as Mr. Hutton has described, took place at a varied rate across the country, related to just where people were starting from and the way in which local authorities in particular made accessibility available to the young people who were in schools.
Thank you.
Can I just go back and add something to the problems involved for staff, in that this was, for many staff, something totally new, working online and providing online lessons, either by recording them or to trying to do them live. And doing them live became very difficult because nobody turned up. As I said, the young people's days had turned round, and therefore they thought, if I'm doing a live lesson, there's only 2 young people in the class out of 30, it's a total waste of time. Not for those 2 young people, but for the rest. And then the gaps then appear. You go into the next live lesson and half the class has maybe not been there. So we then moved to recording the lessons, and that involved an issue of training, of sort of professional learning, and how to do that. And therefore my computing department took on another responsibility of trying to train people, colleagues, about how to use Zoom, how to use Microsoft Teams and Google Meet, and to make sure that was done properly. And how did they do that with various spreadsheets and sharing the screens and whatnot? This was all new technology, this was all new experience for them, and it was quite frightening for a lot of people, a lot of colleagues, because change is very difficult in some cases.
In terms of the national picture, Mr. Thulis, the theme of digital learning and its challenges is one that you've brought out throughout your statement, and you speak about the pandemic having tested systems that were then found wanting. At paragraph 25 of your statement, you say SLS has always known that digital poverty was a major problem for certain sections of the population, and suspected that Education Scotland, the national body tasked with providing digital learning, was not up to scratch. Can you perhaps first of all explain to us, just very briefly, Education Scotland's role in general terms?
Education Scotland had a national role in, we could spend a good hour and a half or more explaining this one, but to try and cut it short, had a national role in kind of 3 main areas. One was the support of the curriculum and the support of teachers in the delivery of the curriculum. Second role was in educational leadership in the area of Education Scotland, which was previously SCEL and which was taken into Education Scotland. And the third role was to do with Her Majesty's Inspectorate, as it was in the time.
Thank you. In respect of digital learning in particular, how was it that SLS saw their role?
So Education Scotland.
Education Scotland's role in relation to digital learning in particular?
There was an pre-pandemic, there was an expectation that digital learning would become part of what learning was. and it was natural to assume that Education Scotland would be in the fore in the delivery of training for staff, materials for the training of staff, and materials to use with young people. So that expectation was there pre-pandemic. When the pandemic came about, when young people were out of school, the situation which Mr Hutton described, where schools were to an extent kind of left on their own to work out how to make this work, was the way in which it started to pan out. There was not a great deal of support, certainly in the very early stages, available from Education Scotland on their website, and it took a long time for it to start to wind up within the organisation to let them understand what the education community needed in terms of support in relation to digital learning.
Thank you. You mentioned there that there was an expectation pre-pandemic. Was that in the immediacy before the pandemic, or is that quite a long-standing expectation? It
was long-standing, and it was tied into the government's commitment in making digital devices available to all young people. So that expectation was an expectation of Education Scotland as an organisation in taking forward educational thinking in the early 21st century, and also an expectation of the government providing hardware out there into the educational community, which that training could then be used to take forward where there to have been no pandemic.
And it's clear from what you've just said that you don't consider that that role was fulfilled, or at least not fully realised.
It would be perhaps unkind to say that it was not fulfilled, but given what happened quite so suddenly, and when it did, then the organisation was found wanting and been ready and prepared to upscale in a way which could support the profession and support young people's learning in a way consistent with not having to actually be in the school building.
And again, is that, as a result of that, the impacts that we've heard about in connection with online learning and the impacts on teachers and learners?
Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned there that they were able to to provide, was it resources or?
It was not so much resources but guidance, and when eSchool became available, then Education Scotland leapt onto that one and made that one work and made that available across the country in a way which provided the support which was not there in the early stages.
And at what stage was it that eSchool became available?
My recollection of it would be maybe 3 to 4 weeks in. And
was eSchool an organisation that SLS was aware of pre-pandemic?
We were all aware of eSchool, we were aware of what it was and what it was intended to do. And whoever it was, whether Education Scotland, I suspect it would be Education Scotland, grasped a hold of it to say, if we expand this, if we upscale this, then it will fill the gap which now is very, very apparent. And it had become apparent that young people were not going to be in school for quite some time. It wasn't going to be something that was going to be passed within 3 or 4 weeks. It was going to be longer term than that, and that's when it was upscaled and started to be introduced to higher capacity than it was originally intended.
Thank you. And was the impact of that to alleviate some of the challenges? Thank you. I want to move on now to discussing hub schools with you. And I'm going to ask you about that, first of all, Mr Hutton, because you were in practice during the pandemic, as well as having your national role with SLS. And you've provided quite a bit of detail on this in your statement. But before I go on to hub schools, I want to ask you, Mr Thulis, about something that you say in your statement at paragraph 15. You talk about a dual aspect to education involving learning on the one hand and what you term a social care aspect. Can you explain to us what it is you mean by that social care aspect?
I think perhaps to give this a bit of context and to give a bit of understanding, in that schools, by their very nature, in that they drew young people together into one place at a certain and acknowledged point in time, were useful in two ways. Firstly, it made education formal. Young people understood that they were coming to school, their parents understood that they were coming to school, and they were coming to school to learn. But in that young people were in the building for 5.5 hours a day, it then became kind of apparent to other agencies out there within the community that this was a uniquely useful way of gaining access to and supporting young people who were vulnerable out there within the community. So the school picked up not just the educational imperative, but it also picked up the part of the social care imperative. And that was built into the statutory functions of the school, that they had to liaise with external agencies in the support of young people, not just in their learning, but as a duty of care to young people.
Thank you. We'll come on to speak a bit about cross-sector working and partnership working with agencies such as social services or speech and language in a short while, but perhaps you can explain for us just now how a school discharged that statutory obligation pre-pandemic in connection with social care.
Every school, every secondary school had a guidance staff, and the guidance staff were part of their responsibility was for the pastoral care of young people. Now, if they became aware during the course of the support which they were giving young people that there were issues at home or within the community, then those issues were shared with social work department, among other agencies. If social work or other agencies were aware of issues out there within the community, then they shared them within the school. So although we operated with different protocols, and we'll perhaps talk about these later on, the protocols kind of emphasised the kind of joint working as it was displayed in respect of care, duty of care to individual children.
And how was it that the closure of schools and the move to online learning impacted a school's ability to discharge that obligation?
As I said earlier, one of the advantages of the school was that young people came to school. They were in the building. Hence, there was a point of contact there, and the guidance teacher was the point of contact within the school. If there was a concern, then case meetings would be set up, parental visits would take place, various other agencies would be contacted, and we would start to look at working around the child. That work started to fall away as soon as you could not get physical contact with people who were out there. Now, this was taking place at a time when there were all sorts of other things going on out there. There was a pandemic, people were ill, people within the various agencies within the schools were ill, so contact and communication became much, much more difficult as soon as you did not have a place where the young person was there and could be visited by the agencies that were required to support that child.
In terms of the teacher, the classroom teacher or the guidance staff, being aware there was an issue, how did the school closure impact their ability to discern when there was something?
Unless young people were in the hub and were able to be observed within the hub, then there was no way where the school could, unless somebody informed us, that the school could observe and pick up any issues which were ongoing in a child's life.
Okay. Mr. Hutton, I want to come to you now about some of the practical considerations relating to operating a hub school. I understand from your statement that Grove Academy operated, indeed you've said it today, as a cluster hub, and you've said in your statement that you're a little bit uncomfortable with how it operated. Can you tell us a little bit about the source of that discomfort?
Yes, I had a cluster of 3 primary schools, 3 quite large primary schools, and Grove itself, and up until then, we'd worked very, very closely together as a cluster, and we all got on very well, which is a kind of team mentality that was very positive. When it came to the first hub, suddenly I only had a certain amount of young people, children of key workers, plus the vulnerable young people from my own school, and suddenly all these young people from the 3 primaries, and I wasn't used to, I suppose, younger children and dealing with them, and also it was strange. I'd never used the word my school, but I found it strange to have other people in my school, in my building, and having to share it with them. But I soon got over that, I have to say, and we did settle down to work as we had done before, very, very successfully. I think for the young people from the primary, it was far more intimidating to come into a huge secondary school, and we therefore made sure that they were only going as short a distance from the front door as possible, and that they always had the same classroom, no matter which young people were in. because it did vary between, particularly with the children of key workers, because they didn't always have to come in each day because their parents were maybe at home looking after them. But so there was a suite of rooms allocated to each of the primary schools, and another set of rooms that we used as secondary. And I think that worked particularly well. There was always a member of the primary school, usually one of the heads or the deputies there, so each school still operated on its own within Grove Academy. I think the office staff there, they also interchanged, so we had people from support staff from other schools as well coming in to help and support any inquiries that came from parents.
In connection with the staffing of hub schools, how was that organised?
That was, well, there were two different ways of doing it. First of all, when we were in the first lockdown and we had the cluster hub, then we all did our individual staffing issues for each primary. And then when we went into the second lockdown, when it was just every school had its own hub, and so it was just back to being the secondary school, again, it was organised within the school. I organised my own school with the staffing. I felt it was important that I did that because I knew all the ins and outs of some of my staff and the issues that they had, particularly if they were shielding. They were shielding either themselves or they were shielding somebody very vulnerable in their family. And again, it was this balancing of ordinary teachers and principal teachers' responsibilities as teachers in ensuring the teaching and learning of the young people went on, and also being there in school to support the hubs, and thirdly, to put stuff online as well. So there was, I suppose, a couple of balls that they were all trying to juggle at the same time. So when I was building up a rota, we made sure that it was, in a way, voluntary, but we made sure that it was spread evenly over the time. People would say to me, I've got a class at that point and I want to do a live lesson or a recording lesson, or I've made an arrangement with a young person to speak to them, can I move it? And we were quite flexible with that, because I think in some schools I know that they use support staff, lab technicians and support for learning assistants to look after young people. I wasn't keen to do that because I think at the end of the day it should have been teachers, qualified teachers, who did that. The other issue in running a hub was to make sure that the vulnerable young people had, particularly at the ESN, and we might be coming on to this later on, and I can speak later.
Yes, we'll come on to speak about the ESN provision in a short while. But you've touched there on the importance, in your view, of having teaching staff manning the hubs. What was the format of the lessons within hub schools? Were children present there to be cared for and to be supervised and accessing online learning, or were they getting a live lesson in class?
Because it was a different number of people in every day and different on a kind of rota, it wasn't, and because in the secondary there was a wide range of vulnerable young people from S1 to 4 mainly, not so many, maybe 1 or 2 in S5, or there were the children of key workers, and that changed every day. They were all doing different subjects, and particularly when you get to S3, 4, and 4 and 5 in particular, they all have a different curriculum in many ways. And so it was absolutely impossible to have a live lesson for each one. But what we did have was, if a young person had a problem, the teacher looking after them and supervising them would try and help as best they can, or send them to somebody else who might be in the school whose subject speciality that was. So for the most part, they were doing online, and therefore for the secondary young people who were in the hubs, they were mainly based in the computing rooms and the library, so that they had access online to lessons, and therefore the supervising teacher would go around and help and support, but may also have been trying to support young people online themselves at the same time. So again, it's this idea of balancing various different things at the one time.
Thank you. Mr. Thulis, in connection with the description there of what happened, certainly with a state school in Dundee City Council, is that something that was replicated across local authorities, to your knowledge, or was it varied?
It was more or less replicated across local authorities. The experience of young people was more or less the same, given that there was a limited availability of access to learning just by the nature of the groups of young people who were coming into schools. And schools, following the same sort of pattern as Grove Academy did, made the best of what they could do.
Thank you. I want to ask now about the eligibility criteria for attendance at hub schools, and the inquiry is aware that these hubs were open to the children of key workers and to vulnerable children. And I want to look with you at the application of that, Mr Hutton. At paragraph 22 of your statement, you say the children of key workers had to register with the school or the local authority, with vulnerable pupils being highlighted by guidance and support for learning departments within the school. Am I to understand from that, Mr Hutton, that schools were determining eligibility in connection with who was vulnerable, and local authorities were determining eligibility for key workers?
Yes and no, in the sense that if we can deal with the vulnerable young people, definitely it was from the school's point of view, from recommendations from guidance and from the support for learning department in particular, about which young people we felt needed to come into school. And that had to be really agreed with the parents as well, that they felt that they would benefit. Now, most parents, when offered the opportunity to have their children still go to school, basically seized that. One or two didn't. But I think when you categorise the young people, most of these young people would be what I call level 3 to 5 in the ASN scale, that they needed support in some way. That may be that they had physical needs. It might mean that they had personal needs, personal health needs, or that they had dyslexia, autism, and other such examples. And so therefore they needed possibly individualised learning, usually with a support for learning teacher or a support for learning assistant. And for some of these young people, they need consistency, they need a routine, and they need to be usually being looked after by one constant person. That doesn't happen all the time, but they get to know the young people. And so one of the issues we had for some of the vulnerable young people was that they were not getting the usual support person that they were used to, and therefore that caused one or two issues as well.
You mentioned there an ASN scale and gave some examples of those who might be in 1 to 3. Is that a national scale that's applied?
There is a national scale of sorts, determined in different ways in different local authorities, but more or less it's the same.
But just perhaps it's a concept that's recognised nationally.
Yes, absolutely.
That may have differences. Thank you. Was there scope, Mr Hutton, for parents and carers, or indeed pupils, to self-refer for a hub school place on account of vulnerability, or did it need to be flagged by the school first?
That's a good question. I would hope that if they self-referred, they would be taken up without any shadow of a doubt, because our whole being is about the protection of young people and making sure that they get the support that they need. And if some parent came to me and said, look, that my young person needs the routine that they always have, could he or she come in, we would probably have said absolutely yes.
Perhaps contribute to that one, in that at the start, as it was with a great many other parts of what we were doing at that point in time, no one knew what we were doing, and we'd never done this before. It was something we didn't know, or weren't able to anticipate how it was going to turn out. So in the very early stages, the kind of narrow criteria in relation to those who were entitled to come to Hub was applied. But once we got a grasp of the numbers who were coming into the Hub, once we gained an understanding of the number of staff who were going to be available to support young people within the Hub, then all schools across the country started to kind of blur the edges of who they were going to bring in. To give a very good example, if the young person was the son or daughter of a school teacher who could be employed by being in a hub, if their child was in the hub of their own local secondary school, then it was obvious and common sense to deal with that in that kind of fringe area of the eligibility to come to the hub. But it evolved as time went on from the narrow interpretation of the criteria at the early stages into something which was workable and sensible later on.
and actually suited the needs of the young people in the school. And if I can go on to the key workers, because I think you asked me about that as well. But
yes, was that eligibility determined by the local authority or by the school, or a combination of both?
A combination of both, if my memory serves me correctly. But they had to, initially in Dundee anyways, apply through the local council, but there were a wee bit of inundation of applications for that. And then we had the problem, so we took them in the school. There were criteria, if I remember right, of what a key worker was. Yep. And sometimes that was difficult to gauge. You know, obviously, if they worked for the medical services, they were, or the fire brigade or the police, that was a given. But when they were on in careers which stretched out from that, it was a question of how far do you stretch the key worker idea. But at the end of the day, I would say most schools just said, yeah, we'll take them. But there was always that caveat that if you began to take everybody, more young people would come back, and we would be back in the situation of there's a risk of contamination. And again, that was something else that we had to make sure in the hubs, that there was still social distancing between the young people. So in a classroom that normally would have taken maybe 30 young people, you could only have 12 to make sure that they still had the 2 metre distancing. And that, I think, for the primaries was very, 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 very difficult to make sure that young people of 5, 6 actually kept 2 metre distancing. It was difficult enough with S1 and 2, but it was something we had to keep in mind. And so therefore, although you maybe only had 30 young people in, you had to look maybe 3 to 4 classrooms where they were spread out.
I want to, you both set out that in your statements that in your view hub schools didn't cater particularly well, or perhaps not at all, for those who had ASN, especially those with profound learning needs. If I can come to you, Mr. Thulis, at paragraph 50 of your statement, you say, a significant number of young people with health and personal care needs who could have been supported within school were not, due to it being unsafe to do at the outset. The mislearning of these young people was difficult to catch up on. I suppose the first question is, were hub school places offered to such learners?
At the beginning, once we kind of recognised that schools were not going to be opening, again, to reflect on the membership of SLS, there was membership from mainstream secondary schools to special schools, and special schools that catered for young people who required very personal support. Schools shut down overnight, and to bring young people who required such quite significant personal support into school without PPE, because it wasn't available, was an issue in the early stages of this. And the professional associations, not just School Leaders Scotland, all the professional associations made the case very, very early on in terms of equity, that young people should not be prohibited because there was not PPE available there. And that started, it picked up very, very quickly, and we got round about, not so much round about it, but we started to support those young people. Within mainstream schools, the availability of hand cleansing and masks and so on picked up very, very quickly. So from a standing start across the various sectors of secondary education, going from special schools through ASN within mainstream schools, we got to grips fairly quickly with what was required to enable those schools to operate on the basis of hub. Given that, if we're looking at ASN, generally speaking, education can go from being one-to-one to small group education, which quite obviously is much closer contact than 12 young people in a standard-sized classroom with one member of staff somewhere distant from them. So it took a wee bit of working around, but we got there. We got there reasonably quickly, I would like to suggest as well.
Thank you. You've touched on this before in connection with cross-sector working and partnership working when you spoke about the social care aspect of education. At paragraph 45 of your statement, Mr. Thulis, you speak about some aspects of cross-sector working. Can you explain to the inquiry, please, what sort of cross-sector working is necessary for a school leader, for example, with whom and to what end?
There are aspects of duty of care which are statutory duties of schools and school leaders. And Her Majesty's inspectors will check up when they come to inspect schools if these duties are being carried out. It's a matter of law that these things should be done. Generally speaking, when you start to work in that way, you're working cross-sector with various other agencies, largely social work department, but various other support agencies out there. And to take these things forward, on almost every occasion there will be some sort of case conference to set that up. And at the case conference, within the protocols of the various groups who are there supporting the child, certain things will be agreed. But the majority of these things require coming together of the professionals to make sure that these are being carried out properly. And once you start to get into a situation where you can't meet, you can't bring a speech therapist into school, for example, then life becomes very, very difficult and very, very challenging. Now, the kind of legal part of this, of statutory duties of care, is the kind of perhaps the easiest part of this, because it's laid down there and it's quite clear what this young person can be expected to get in terms of support. A level kind of above that or beyond that, there is a significant cohort of young people within the school who require care of some sort, of a more informal nature. If you're struggling to do the very formal stuff and you're trying to find ways round about doing that and spending time in doing that, there's not as much time left to deal with the other cohort of young people who don't fall within the statutory part of it, but do deserve care and fit into the care network which the school is going to operate. So it became very, very challenging in all aspects of providing care to vulnerable young people, however vulnerable more or less they be, given the nature of the pandemic, and that you didn't know how to make contact. You certainly couldn't have face-to-face contact at times, and if people were going to be absent from work, they were going to be shielding themselves. That started to put more gaps into the care system. So it was a very, very fraught and challenging time in the early stages of making sure that continuity of care and support was available to young people, given the kind of pressures that staff were working under.
And I suppose, is it fair to deduce from what you've said there in connection with the obligations and the care network for those who already require that informal care network, that should such a vulnerability or need arise during the period they are not within the school premises, that would be more difficult for you to know? It
is much more difficult in that they are not on the premises. And more so than that, if they're not in the premises, they're out there in the community. And many young people, the difficulties which they faced were difficulties on account of being out there in the community. If they were in school for 5.5 hours a day, we knew where they were and we knew what to do and we knew that we could support them. It became a huge, huge challenge when we didn't know, for a great many young people, where they were and what they were doing.
You mentioned at paragraph 47, Mr. Thewlis, that partnership working or this cross-sector working has not recovered post-pandemic. Why is that?
Due to what we missed out in doing during the pandemic, and due to the fact that the pandemic has put more people into the position of requiring of care and special care.
Okay. I want to move on now to looking at the changes to the SQA exam diet and the alternative certification model referred to as ACM. Both of you speak about this in your statements, and it's clear from your statements that you consider the ACM to have been a successful process. First of all, just to give us a bit of grounding in what it is we're speaking about, can I ask you, Mr. Thewlis, to explain to us just briefly how the exam diet was altered in 2020 and 21, and also what the ACM was?
Again, to give a background to that, the examination system as such was always, its strength was its formality within school, and it comes back to what happened overnight pre-pandemic and pandemic in relation to what happened to schools. The examination system was based on the principle that young people attended school for 295 days per year. And at some point during that period of attendance, there was an examination diet where young people went into the assembly hall or wherever it was within the school, sat down at a desk and sat an examination which tested the learning which they had obtained over the previous year within school. That was a very straightforward and simple system, and it was never seriously called into question. Perhaps it should have been. That's another argument for another time and another place. But that's the system as was. Pupils knew it, teachers knew it, and parents knew it. All of a sudden, March 2019, that stopped because there is going to be no exams. SQA was left in a very, very difficult and challenging situation at that point in time. And there were young people who were very close to the point of certification but could no longer finish off that part of the education which required them to get to the exams, that kind of 6-week final period, nor were they able to sit exams. So the SQA had to find a way of making sure that those young people were given due credit for the learning which they had gone through and which the level of attainment and achievement which they had exhibited. It would be safe to say that there could have been better ways of doing it in certainly the first exam diet. And we all know around the controversy that happened in the August of that year when the exam results came out. But to be fair to SQA, they had to come up with a system and come up with a system very, very quickly to deal with that. However, thereafter, having gone through that and having understood the challenges, the difficulties and the mistakes that were made at that time, SQA engaged with the profession very, very quickly in relation to making sure that in the following year, were there to be no exams and were there to be major disruptions to education throughout the year, that they were going to be in a better position to make sure that young people actually did gain true and accurate accreditation for what they had done and what they had achieved. Discussions started off very, very early on, immediately after the August fiasco in terms of results, to make sure that people understood the changes which were going to be made. Changes to curriculum, changes to assessment procedures, and changes to the way in which the exam system, if it was going to happen, would take place. And between August and through until May and June of the following year, was a meeting I was attending a meeting every Friday morning, along with other members of the professional associations, with SQA, to come up with the so-called ACM model, AQM, to make sure that the system was robust and more so that people understood the system and what was going to happen and the way in which it was going to impact on qualifications if there were to be no exam diet the following year.
Is that group the SQA Strategic Overview Group?
Yes.
That you were a member of? Thank you. Mr Hutton, you set out in your statement at paragraph 61 that SQA removed some sections from the formal assessments and that this was for reasons of accessibility. Can you explain how that made the exams more accessible?
Yeah, so the SQA issues a curriculum, a syllabus, as it were, on which they will base the exams for higher, National 5 or Advanced Higher. And in some of the subjects, they decided there are often options of what they can do, and so they limited the options that were available to the schools that they were in the ACM that needed to be tested. To a great extent, that was a good idea, but if it came quite late on, and therefore some schools and some departments, subject areas, had already decided they were going to do this option, and then it wasn't going to be examined, and so that time had been lost, and so there was a mad rush to get other options done. The practical subjects had a major issue because of the restrictions imposed by the Scottish Government, quite rightly, in the schools. that they couldn't do some of the practical work. A, because they were out of school. B, because when they came back, they were still social distancing, and C, they did not have the time left to finish their models, their artwork, or whatever. And for music in particular, there was an issue with practicing, because they have to perform, they have to have a performance there, and for brass and woodwind, they could not use them in the school. Now in the summer runs, that's fine, because they could go outside and stand under a gazebo, but in the winter it was very difficult to stand out in the cold and practice trumpet, flute and whatnot. So there was an issue there with the practical subjects.
Again, in that same paragraph, you say there may have been some, while it made the exams more accessible, there may have been some longer-term negative impacts arising from that decision. Can you tell us a bit more about what these impacts are? Because
the syllabus had been restricted somewhat, therefore there were gaps in that young person's knowledge, which normally they would have had. So if they've been doing higher maths, the amount of areas being covered in the exam was reduced. So when they came to do advanced higher, eventually they had knowledge missing, and there was gaps that they had to then fill in to find out how they got on. Obviously, when they went to university, they were also having had gaps in their higher courses or their advanced higher courses. They were not prepared to take on the next stage of if they were doing a degree. And that compared maybe to what happened elsewhere in the UK, where I don't think, if I recollect, that they took that approach, and that they still had the full-bred syllabus for A-levels or whatever the qualification was. So that has continued, I suppose, into university or college in the courses that they're doing. So the gaps, with the best will in the world to try and ease the situation and make it more practical, there was I suppose, a negative impact. For every action, there's an equal action reaction. The reaction was that they had gaps in their knowledge.
Okay, so can I perhaps add a bit onto what the kind of difference between the first exam diet and the second exam diet, in that much of the results for the first exam diet were very largely based on teacher evaluation of what the young people had been doing through the majority of the course of that year. When we looked at the ACM model, it was made very clear to teachers very, very early on that they had to be absolutely robust in the way in which they did their assessments based on the standards which the SQA had done there. And taking that sort of level of robustness on early on made sure that as the year went on, the teacher estimates were actually pretty much more spot on than they had been in the previous year in relation to making the ACM model work.
I would agree with that, and I think in the 2020 results, they were mainly based, because we were nearly the end of the academic year, on prelims and examinations and evidence that was quite clear to many teachers about how their the young people in their class had performed. But obviously there's still a bit after the prelim where it's not been examined that they had to then make a judgment. The schools then had to make sure they were quality assuring that by looking at trends from the past, by looking at the individual young people. And I spent an awful lot of time with all my 17 departments, at least a couple of hours with them, to looking at how did they come to make that decision of their estimates. Now, we normally do have estimates. Estimates go in every year to the SQA, which are part and parcel of the procedures, and particularly when they come to appeals. But with the ACM, that was a different ballgame. We should have had plenty of time. Now, schools, one of the issues, I think, is that also some schools were absolutely convinced that there would be no exams again in 2021. And therefore they did, as Mr. Hewlett has said, they had prepared that. Other schools lived in a kind of fairyland where they thought actually there will be exams will come back because the hires have to be there, and therefore didn't do as thoroughly the preparation for the young people to have the evidence that they based their ACM on. So there was a wee bit of a disparity there. I wouldn't be able to quantify the difference between different schools, but there was that. And therefore, when if a school had built up, or a department had built up the evidence, they were in a very strong position to give a very accurate estimate of how that young person had performed, apart from, of course, in the practical subjects, which was a bit more tricky, as I said earlier. Again, the quality assurance had to take place within schools, within departments, with either well, in my case, with me and with the link deputy for that department, and going through not just looking at the statistics and the trends from the past, but actually about the individual young people and why I felt that that young person, given what they had achieved the year before, had achieved this year. And then there was a step where the local authority, in my case Dundee, came in through our education officers and verified and checked with us and discussed with us how we had the processes that we'd gone through to arrive at the ACM estimates, and whether there had been quality assurance. So I would actually say it was far more thorough. One other thing that Mr. Hewlett has said is about applying the standard. If there's a silver lining here, it is the fact that many more teachers had to be more aware of the standard of that the SQA sets, and more importantly, how to apply that, because usually that was the bailiwick of markers, who are teachers at school who volunteer to mark, and the examination teams who then do the quality assurance of the marking, and then come to awarding the cut-off scores, which award the grades A, B, C. So I think that is something that was difficult for a lot of teachers who were not involved in the SQA or who had never done marking, to actually learn what the standard was and thus how to apply it.
Thank you. I just want to build a little on, you've explained there on the impacts on staff, and you've set that out a little bit earlier on. Mr. Hutton, you speak at paragraph 41 of your statement about institutions that schools work alongside. You say institutions such as Education Scotland and His Majesty's Inspectorate of Education were unsupportive and effectively missing in action. I had no contact with either of these bodies during the pandemic, and I understand from your statement that that's something that you concur with also, Mr. Thulis. Mr. Hutton, what was the impact of that reality for school leaders?
Well, there was no impact in the sense that they didn't do anything, and they were, I suppose, separate from the rest of the education, because they weren't actually in schools. I think it would have been very useful if they had offered to come into schools and help, particularly with the standards of education, particularly with the HMIE, how an education's got about what the standard was, to help and support the ACM, and also help and support covering staff. Now, we've talked about the hubs, we've talked about the return to schools, where staff were juggling various things together, both teaching in the classroom and providing online work for those that were off or who had been told to isolate. Because at that time, although we were back, we were still having to isolate young people. And, you know, I would get a call on a Saturday night to say, this young person is now infected with COVID. Can you then tell me all the people round about who were sitting within 2 metres? And therefore, there were also staff who were ill. And in the second, after the second lockdown, there was more staff absence from COVID in my school than there had been during the first outbreak. And therefore, we were trying to we were struggling there with covering classes, and it would have been quite useful. I know there's not maybe a great number of people involved in Education Scotland and HMIE compared to the number of teachers in Scotland, but every little helps, as I say, and if there had been an offer there, I think most head teachers would have bitten their hand off to get them into school to support and get their expertise and use that, because they are, all of them, school leaders as well, or have been leaders in the past.
Mr. Thulis.
Can I perhaps come into that one? And it comes back to the start of the earlier description of the kind of 3 functions of Education Scotland. Take them in reversed order, perhaps, in that Her Majesty's inspectors visit schools, and they visit schools on the basis of determining quality and standards. They pride themselves on their strapline of sort of challenge and support. Now, quite obviously, getting out to inspect schools just couldn't be done. Therefore, the challenge part of it was not going to be there. But there was not a great deal of evidence of any kind of support that came from the HMI part of Education Scotland during the pandemic. The Scottish College for Educational Leadership, that bit that sat in there as well, again, kind of ceased to function a wee bit because just it was not feasible to do that. And I've got no complaint whatsoever, concern at all over the scale part of Education Scotland.
What is the scale part?
Scottish College for Educational Leadership. What they do is support and develop leadership strategies to bring on the next generation of school leaders. So from my organisation's part of it perspective, very, very useful indeed. But again, not a great deal for them to kind of contribute at that point. I'll come back to the contribution part later on. The third part was the curriculum development and support part. Now, given the pre-pandemic situation, in that there wasn't really a great deal came to us as a profession from Education Scotland and that part of Education Scotland. If you kind of sought it out, you might have found bits and pieces. Their website in particular was at virtually no use at all. When the pandemic came, therefore, there was not really very much there for that part of Education Scotland to provide to us. And what Mr Hutton described earlier on in terms of a school preparing itself and engaging with its community was what happened across the country, with not a great deal of support coming our way from Education Scotland. I have in my statement at one point kind of related an incident kind of later on. And it was when we were starting to come back out of the pandemic and schools were starting to get themselves back up and running again. And Scottish Government tasked Her Majesty's Inspectorate with getting out there and finding out what had happened within schools and start looking at the way in which we can make things better should this happen in the future. And was on a Zoom call or a Teams call, Teams perhaps, with various other of the professional associations and representatives from the HMI part of Education Scotland. And they were describing that what they would like to do is come out into schools, have meetings with school leaders, a couple of hours to find out what's happening and how we could take things forward from here. And at which point, it's touching on something that Graham said earlier, said quite clearly to them, if you phone up a head teacher today and say, I'm from Education Scotland, what can I do to help you? The answer would be, come in here and teach classes, because we really are struggling. Things are getting better, but we really are struggling. Second point, if you want to find out what's happening within schools, if you send somebody out to meet a head teacher for a couple of hours, you maybe find out something, but head teachers have got much more important things to do at this point in time. And they'll spend time with you, because they do, but you'll find out something, perhaps not an awful lot. And the third thing is, you're not really doing yourself any favours in terms of PR if this is what you think head teachers need just now, because we need to try and get schools back up and working and get young people back into learning. If you want to find out what's happening in schools, tell me how many people you have in here within Education Scotland who are GTC registered. I'll tell you the number of schools that you could send one of these people to. Embed one of them in embed them in schools for 3 or 4 weeks. Over that period, they can cover classes, they can talk to staff, they can talk to pupils, they can talk to parents, they can see how the school head teacher is dealing with what's going on. If you want to find out the impact and if you want to find out what's needing to be done in the future, do it that way. And you'll find out an awful lot more. You'll increase your street cred among the profession, and you'll actually find out much, much more about schools than you will do it in any other way. It went nowhere, it didn't happen. I've got to say, I never thought that it would.
Thank you. And the inquiry, of course, will be going on to look at decisions and implementation of these decisions, so that's helpful information for us there. I want to ask you, we've spoken about impacts on learners in connection with digital inclusion, and you've mentioned a lot about practical subjects and assessments. Mr Hutton, you say at paragraph 76 and following of your statement that there have been some negative and what appear to be, from what you've said, ongoing impacts in relation to the behaviour of children, young people, and attendance at school, and also parental engagement. And of course these are quite discrete but perhaps linked issues. Can you explain to us why you think these impacts have arisen?
If I deal with the attendance first, I think that has gone down by 5 to 10. I think it is slowly improving again, but there's still a large gap, far larger than we had pre-pandemic, of young people actually attending school. And I think, as Mr. Thewlis said earlier, there is this concept that, well, we still got our exams, but we weren't there all the time, and therefore, do we need to be there all the time? And I think young people have become more independent in many ways through the COVID pandemic, and being left to their own devices, and now think, I'm not engaged with school. What I'm doing here is not really relevant to what I want to do later on in life, and therefore there is a kind of, I'm not going to play ball anymore. And that's where we are challenged to make sure that the curriculum we are offering our young people meets their needs and suits their needs. And that's, again, that's a long-term implication of the COVID situation. There's also, or has tended to be in many schools, and the current president of SLS wrote an article about it that we submitted to inquiry, about young people who don't truant out with the school, but truant within the school, and are refusing to go to classes, who maybe congregate in the toilets or in sneaky corners of the school, and they then build up a following, and they lap the school. In other words, they go round and round, avoiding going to classes and disrupt lessons. And therefore, even in the best schools, if you want to call them that, where there's usually not been a lot of discipline issues, these have still arisen, and that young people have been turned off by the curriculum and been turned off by their experiences and the gaps in their knowledge, that they are not playing ball with staff. And therefore that involves, as it was in my own school, the senior leadership team going out into the corridors far more and trying to get these young people to go back to school, back to class and learn. And they were out of the way of doing that in many ways, and it's been a long, long process, and it's just one of these hidden implications and the damage that's been done to young people that will go on for many years to come, I'm afraid. There was one other aspect.
Behaviour was another aspect.
The behaviour, yeah. Again, young people had been left in many ways to their own devices. They were lonely. They had a lack of social involvement. And therefore, when we came back into a routine, that was almost anathema to some of them. Not all of them. I mean, the vast majority of young people fell back into school very easily. A large majority were absolutely relieved to get back to school. They were, because they were then learning again, they were also socialising again, and they were getting some human contact from their colleagues, their classmates, and also from their teachers. And therefore, for a small minority, there's always been a small minority in the schools who would not behave and whom you have to coax and put more support in. That kind of grew in many ways as a result of the pandemic. And a lot of it was low level. I have to say, an increase in low level in discipline. But again, as we're hearing now, and the Cabinet Secretary has been trying to deal with this with various summits about how we improve behaviour in young people. And my own feeling is it has to be about making sure they've got the support there, and that they have a curriculum that suits their needs, and also that the learning and teaching is quality.
The one other aspect there, sorry I'd rolled up so many questions into one there, I'm mindful I only have 15 minutes at most left. You mentioned at 78 that there is more parental conflict. Well, you see, first of all, attendance has decreased, and both parents and children don't see anything wrong with that, so it's not just the children's perception. You say there is more parental conflict than there used to be with schools. Some parents could not cope with children being at home during the pandemic and they maybe let their children do what they wanted. So this aspect of parental engagement being diminished as a result of the experience during the pandemic period. Can you expand on that
what
for
I'm
us?
hearing from my colleagues in SLS across Scotland, there has been a rise in the amount of arguments, shall I put it that way, that they're having with parents that they probably wouldn't have had in the past, where the parents are absolutely adamant that their child is right and will not, even when the evidence is put to them, will not agree to that. So in many ways, it looks to us as if there is, they take the path of least resistance. They have maybe not been able to deal appropriately with the young people when they've been off school and at home all the time, and they've been doing their own work, their employment, if they're having to work at home, and therefore they've allowed the young people to do as they wished, or been rather weak with setting parameters. And we've now found out that has grown, and that parents take their young people's side, whereas before that would not have been the case. Now, this may be a societal change in many ways about how we approach, but our view is that we always want to work together with the parents, and because at the end of the day, we all have one thing in common, is we want to see the young people in our care and in their care, obviously, do well.
You mentioned there that it may be societal. Is it linked, in your view, to the pandemic experience of lockdown and restrictions and school closures?
I would say so.
You mentioned there in your response to my question about conflict and perhaps what might perhaps be viewed as negative engagement. Is that what you're seeing more than disengagement?
That's a difficult question for me now that I've been out of school for over a year to say exactly, but I think there probably is more disengagement in a way than there is with arguments with parents.
Thank you. And the inquiry is hearing from organisations who represent parents, so we'll be able to speak to them about similar issues to what we've raised with you there. Just one final question for you both, and you can decide yourselves who wishes to answer first. And that's to ask if you have any key lessons that you consider should be applied to ensure the impact you've spoken about, be they on school leaders, on their staff, on the learners, are addressed and mitigated?
Answer, very easy
Mr. Hutton's
to
looking
answer,
at you,
yes.
Mr. Thulis, so
Yeah.
thank you.
I think, given the system was tested by the pandemic and what happened within the pandemic, and showed that the system was not as robust as perhaps we thought that it was, that the time is now opportune for starting to look at kind of key aspects of education in Scotland and the way in which we run it, on the basis and on the understanding that to do so would mitigate the worst excesses if we ever find ourselves in this position again, but it would also make Scottish education a much, much better, put it in a much, much better place than it is just now. On the day schools shut down, a significant number of teachers, parents and young people did not understand that there could be a different way of running education. Scottish education has run in the way in which it is run in terms of schools since the Education Act of 1740. Young people at that point were obliged to go to a place where they would meet an adult and be in a room, and that adult would conduct their learning. And that has been more or less the situation since. It has expanded in some ways, it has developed in some ways, but essentially, up until the day schools closed down at the pandemic, that's the way in which it was. We have got to become much more flexible, adaptable and responsive to the way in which young people live their lives and the way in which society out there has developed in terms of engaging in a way in which young people can develop skills and then use those skills in life beyond school. And bringing young people into a building, essentially sitting them in a room with an adult who tells them a story at the front of the room, is not the way to be doing it in the early 21st century. We've got to look at that. And that has major implications for teacher training. It has major implications for the way in which we design schools, and it has major implications for the way in which we spend money and the amount of money which we spend within schools, because we are not meeting the needs of an early 21st century society in the way in which the school system runs. Now, added to that, the exam system which we have, the system which was developed in the kind of late part of the 19th century in response to being able to train people to pass a civil service exam. And it has evolved slightly since then, but it's essentially the same things. People sit more exams in different subjects, but it's essentially the same. At the end of a period of learning, you're put into a situation where you sit down with a pen and a piece of paper, and you write down what you have remembered about your learning. That also is not the type of way in which early 21st century society should be working. There are better ways, more effective ways in ensuring that we use the assessment system to promote, support and enhance learning. And that is going to take major input, major thought, and has major implications for the way in which we train teachers and the way in which we manage the expectations of young people and their parents and employers in relation to the way in which schools operate and what young people are at the point in time when they decide to leave formal education. There are as you will perhaps have kind of worked out from that, there are major discussions to be had within that. But essentially, we cannot carry on doing what we're doing just now in the way in which we're doing it. If we meet another pandemic, we might be slightly better prepared, but we will not be prepared as prepared as we could be. And what the pandemic, if any good has come out of this, what it has done is made us look at, understand and reflect upon the quality, standards, effectiveness, relevance of education that we are providing in Scotland just now.
Thank you. Yes, that links to something you said in your statement at paragraph 48 about normality within the system now is a different normality to 2019. So that was really helpful of you to build on that. Thank you. I want to come to you now, Mr. Hutton, but I don't want to cut you off prematurely, but I'm mindful the stenographers will require a break at 3:30, and indeed that's when we're scheduled to finish. So I know you may have quite an extensive answer for me, but just if you could explain briefly any of the key lessons that you think could mitigate some of the impacts you've set out for us.
I would first of all wholly and wholeheartedly agree with what Mr. Thewlis has just said about the system. It is not fit for the 21st century, and the status quo cannot continue. And I think the stress test of COVID proved that to all extents and purposes. I think there's a lack of an integrated system of how Education Scotland, His Majesty's Inspectorate, now separate, the SQA, or Qualifications Scotland, is about to become the Centre for Teaching Excellence, and all the other various bodies that deal with Scottish education. They don't hold together, they don't join up, and there has to be a better vision for how they will work and how they will support teachers in order to support the young people. They have to be at the centre, and everybody has to be focused on helping them out. I think Mr. Hewlis has highlighted very carefully that the assessment system did not work. It failed again, that stress test. The ACM, to our extent, actually worked very well if it's well prepared in advance and the workload issues are looked into to make sure that that is spread over the year. The Hayward Review, which was recently released in June of last year, came forward with a new structure that would have suited exactly what Mr. Hewlis has said about meeting the needs of young people in the 21st century, focusing on knowledge and skills and how we prepare our young people in order to be engaged with school for the future. They have to see a relevance, and that was what's maybe come out of the COVID situation of schools being closed. They could not see what really the relevance was here and how it would impact on there. And if we want to have a successful country and a better economy, we have to make sure that the young people who are going into that in the future, who will look after us in our old age, that they are better trained, that they are better prepared for life in the 21st century. I think also, we've talked about IT, and I think that has to be looked at very carefully, not just the online resources, not just the hardware and the devices being available on a one-to-one, and I'm hoping that the Scottish Government will be able eventually to come up with the promise that they made, that each young person would have a device and connected to the internet, which will help them. And it is a question of equity there to make sure that all our young people have an equal chance. I think Mr. Hughes has indicated the pandemic did have a negative impact right across the board, but we were not prepared for it. And in many ways, we were fumbling around in the dark to make sure we did the best by our young people. And therefore, we need to make sure that if each school has a business continuity plan, usually in the case of a fire, that we need to look at other things, other scenarios that could erupt in the future, that in order to protect the young people and make sure that their learning goes on. And in that case, there has to be really good communication, and I think that was one of the things I learned, that the communication that we got from School Leaders Scotland to head teachers and other school leaders was exemplary, and therefore we were able to pass that on. And where we were able to pass it on to our staff and explain the mitigations that have been put in place by the Scottish Government, the better that staff understood and were able to support the young people. That's the crux of the matter. You maybe get my passion about it. The young people are why we are in the job. And I think finally, if you're talking about, go back to what I said originally, the SQA in particular has to be more adaptive and flexible and empathetic to young people, and I think involve teachers far more in that, and I think there is a definite movement there. I think they have learned something from the pandemic that is enabling them to move forward as an as an organisation and to become Qualifications Scotland. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned for the whole of Scottish education and how we bring it together for our young people.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my Lord. I don't have any further questions for the witness unless your Lordship has anything to ask.
I don't have any questions to ask, but I would like to say something, unusually. Directing primarily at Mr. Thewlis, but also taking in what Mr. Hutton said. And it's Mr. Thewlis's last remarks. If I may say so, Mr. Thewlis, what you just said was one, if not possibly the most forceful and potent observation in relation to the implications and possible lessons that might be learned from this inquiry, or from this pandemic, and therefore by the inquiry, certainly in the context of education. I can assure you that what you said will be considered by us in the inquiry very, very carefully, because I did find it very, very powerful. I regret to say, or at least my initial impression is, and it is an initial impression because I only heard what you said 5 minutes ago, that my initial impression is that much of what you envisage or consider might, or in your view should be done, we will consider to be beyond the scope of our terms of reference. And I feel that it may require other inquiries or methods of investigation and reporting to achieve what you want. But rest assured, we will think very hard on what you said.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thank you both for your very helpful evidence. Right, that brings us to the end of today. We're back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again.
Thank you.